Hello, how are you doing? And welcome back to the channel. Rest week in the Six Nations, so something a little bit different for you this week. Still talking about the championship, but I'm asking the question, which team in the Six Nations is currently under the most pressure? The most pressure when we look ahead to the third round of fixtures, which happen the following weekend after this. Which side is under the most pressure? And actually, having jotted down a couple of notes, I do think you can make a case for everyone. So I'm going to go through all six teams, the case for why at this moment in time they are under pressure. And then at the end of the video, I will say who I think is under the most pressure at the moment. So do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate all the support there's been over the course of the Six Nations. Obviously does generate a lot more interest than a lot of the other months of the year, so I do appreciate it. If you can like the video, that would be a massive help. But most importantly, as ever, drop a comment down below. Which side do you think is currently under the most pressure in the Six Nations? All right, let's get into it. So I think this is actually quite an interesting question because obviously it completely depends on your perspective of pressure. And the old adage, pressure is a privilege, and that means I'm going to start with Ireland because they have earned the privilege of having pressure on them with expectation for them now to go on and win the Six Nations and do the Grand Slam, particularly after beating France. Over the opening two games of the Six Nations, they look like they are comfortably the better side, the best side, I think, of everyone, including Scotland, who I know have had a really good start. But with that does come a pressure, and they've got a target on their back now. People will be wanting to knock them off. Every side that they're going to come up against knows that they have to be on the absolute top of their game if they're able to get anything out of the match. So therefore, that is a certain type of pressure. And Ireland, as I say, have earned it. I think they've been absolutely brilliant. I think they will go on to do the Grand Slam. I've said that on the channel already. But this isn't a position that Ireland have traditionally held. There aren't too many times in the Six Nations, and particularly with this group of players, where they have been the favourites, particularly after two games. They've got that statement victory against France, the team that they couldn't beat last year, the team that they didn't have a great recent record against. They've done the job on them. They've had a statement victory. Now can they go on? Can they kick on? And can they win the Six Nations? So that in itself is a bit of pressure. Can they back it up? Can they deal with that favourites tag? Personally, I think they will. And I think they will quite comfortably. But even so, that's a pressure they have to deal with. Next up, let's talk about France. Because on the one hand, you could say there can't be too much pressure on them because they've been so good over the last year. They were the Grand Slam champions last year. They were on a record unbeaten run. They didn't lose a game last year. But they have now lost one match. And although that is against the world number one team in the world in Ireland, and it's an understandable defeat, another defeat would start to lead to question marks over them, particularly when you've got to consider that the context of this year for France, and we never want to get too far ahead of them ourselves. I know that it's a real frustration amongst fans when you start speaking about the World Cup when we've got the Six Nations in front of us, and what matters is winning now and this tournament. But I don't think for France they can escape the context of a World Cup on home soil later this year. That is their ultimate target for this calendar year. And I know that's the same for all the teams, but I do think that's a big factor for the French at this moment in time. So you lose another game all of a sudden, and you're losing to a team that people would expect you to beat because they'll be favourites in all those other games. Then all of a sudden, I think the pressure cranks up a notch. I think people start to get a little bit jittery. People within France start to say, is the team falling away at the wrong moment ahead of that World Cup? We hoped that we would be the favourites for that tournament. And for many people, they still will be. And they'll still be one of, I think, at this moment in time, if you were talking about the World Cup and who could win it, you'd have Ireland, France, New Zealand and South Africa as your four main teams. France will still be part of that conversation. But another defeat, I think things just start to get a little bit more nervy. So there is pressure on them now. Okay, we can accept that defeat. You've gone away to Ireland against the best team in the world in the Six Nations. You've been on a brilliant run and you've lost. But now the games they're coming up against are against sides people expect them to win. So that in itself is a form of pressure. And also they've now got pressure to improve. Because for a little while, a number of people, and I said it on this channel, thought that France, despite their victories, particularly in the autumn, were not performing as well as we had seen them do. So now that they have finally lost a game, because you kind of get away with that when you're winning, but now that they have lost, they're under pressure, I think, to improve and start building again towards the World Cup on home soil. Okay, next up, Scotland. They've been brilliant so far, this Six Nations. I think in particular that victory actually against England. I know that they completely dominated Wales and it was a very impressive scoreline, but I think the way in which they came from behind late at Twickenham against England, I know England aren't in the best spot at the moment and I'll come on to them, but I just thought that was an impressive victory for Scotland. I think the sounds coming out of the camp show that this is a Scotland team in a different place to previous years. When they beat England, it wasn't some great joyous moment and a great victory against their biggest rivals as it has been previously. It was, we've got to back it up. Then the next week they went and they backed it up against Wales, who are a team who have been a bit of banana skin for them in recent Six Nations. So I've been impressed with Scotland, but the questions continue to come of, okay, back it up again. You've gone 2 from 2, congratulations to you, and they've been brilliant, they deserve to, and I think for the championship, that's been a really, really good thing. But can you have a meaningful dent, a meaningful impact on this Six Nations? For the first time in the history of the Six Nations. They've got France and Ireland coming up next. Can they win one of those 2 games? They'll be underdogs in both of them, and then they've got Italy on the final weekend. Can they get a scalp in one of those games and put themselves maybe in position to be competing for the championship? I think that's the pressure on Scotland now, and is a pressure which is completely alien to them. How do they deal with it? On to England. This is a tricky one because it's early days for England, but there are already grumblings about the style of play and also about selection. I think there have been improvements in their opening couple of games compared with where they were at the end of the Eddie Jones era. But you look at their next match and they've won one of their 2 games so far, but that victory was against Italy, who people expect them to beat. And a lot of people weren't too enamoured with the performance, although actually, having been at Twickenham, I thought that there were things to be positive about from an England point of view. They got the job done, essentially. But next up, they play Wales in Cardiff. And Wales are a side, I speak as an Englishman here, who consistently get themselves into the exact place they need to be, particularly from a mental point of view, to compete with England in the Six Nations. And we've seen it time and time again, and we've seen it under Warren Gatland. So all of a sudden, if England lose that game to Wales, they've then got pressure games at home to France and away to Ireland. And at this moment in time, I'm giving them no chance of beating Ireland away. France at home could be a little bit closer because of the home field advantage factor. But again, it's just another one of those games where you look at it, if England don't win that game against Wales, then all of a sudden it's looking like another pretty dire and dismal championship. It's potentially another championship where they only win a couple of matches. We'll wait and see. We'll see what happens. Maybe only the 1 victory, who knows? But that's why England are under pressure. They're under pressure to continue to keep improving, but results are a part of that. Okay, 2 more teams to go through. I'll rattle through them. Wales, 2 defeats and 2 comprehensive defeats. I think that bit of context is important from a Welsh perspective. It isn't just that they've lost, it's that they have been resoundingly beaten. And against Ireland, that's to be expected because of how good they are. Against Scotland, equally how well Scotland are playing at the moment, and the fact that it was at Murrayfield, it's kind of understandable. But just on the surface of things, Warren Gatland coming back, his return to Wales, it's really not a great look. Then you throw in the factor of the off-field issues, the issues that have been within the union, the suggestion that as a last resort, the players could strike ahead of that England game because of a dispute between the WRU and the regions and agreeing the budgets going forward for the next 6 years. So there's so many issues with Wales at the moment. They are under a huge amount of pressure to get it right at this moment in time. Only time will tell if they are able to, if that game goes ahead against England. And also, of course, they're under pressure because it's an ageing side. It is a side which has concerns over the quality of players coming through. This is something Warren Gatland has spoken about as well. So Wales at the moment, I think you look at them and they're probably the side in the most negative position, I would argue. Just finally, Italy. I want to touch on the Italians because everyone has the hope of Italy becoming more consistent in the Six Nations. and they beat Wales in the final game of last year's championship, and there is this real desire, this real hope that they're able to kick on again. And I think it would be such a disappointment if they come into this championship, because they won against Australia in the autumn as well, remember, and if it was another tournament where they lose all their games. So I think there is a pressure on Italy, even though the least is expected of them. I think there is an element of pressure to see them win another game, for it not just to be the anomaly almost that proves the rule in terms of that victory against Wales, that they'll continue to be the wooden spoon contenders year after year. There's a hope for them to kick on. I think there's a pressure to come with that, a pressure to step up and again prove their worth to this Six Nations championship, basically, and not just to go back to losing ways. So those are the reasons I think there's pressure on every single team. Who's under the most pressure? I said at the start of the video, it completely depends on your perspective and how much expectation comes into it as well, really. Because I would say for England and Wales, for example, and Italy to a degree, there's not that much expectation for them to be winning loads of games, but there's still pressure because of the context that those sides are in and their individual situations. For me, I'm going to go with Wales here, and I honestly struggled with this. When I jotted it down, as I say, I think there's a case to be made for every team, but I'm going for Wales because I think out of all the teams in the Six Nations so far, they've had the least amount of positives, probably between them and England. Italy obviously had a really good match against France, a close defeat, a game they could have won, and how different this conversation would be if they had got that victory. I don't think there'd be any pressure on them in that situation. But Italy have had that. England have had a good victory against Italy, a tight game against Scotland. It was still a one-score game, and it's a Scotland side who are playing well. And then Scotland, France and Ireland, I think there are so many positives at the moment that, yeah, for me, it just came down to the fact that I don't think we've had really much good to talk about from Wales so far. You might talk about Christians, Daffyd Jenkins coming in, a couple of young players. Other than that, because of the nature of their defeats, that's why I would go with Wales as being under the most pressure at this moment in time in the Six Nations. Hopefully, I've done a relatively decent job of explaining why those sides might be under pressure. Do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, like the video, and drop a comment down below which side in the Six Nations is under the most pressure. All right, I'll see you in the next one.